Welcome to the deep dive. So today we are unpacking a really fascinating stack of sources. On the surface, they look like they were covering completely separate, highly charged social issues.
Right. Things like drug control policy, debates around sex work, even the architecture of punishment and migration systems.
Exactly. You sent us sources that felt like they were from different worlds.
They did. It really felt like we were looking at 4 different policy silos. But as we started digging through the data, the case studies, something else started to emerge.
A pattern.
A really clear pattern, yeah.
Right.
It suggested that the source material wasn't actually about those specific issues at all.
That's it. The real subject of this deep dive is something the sources called the architecture of policy.
It's a bit of a fancy term.
It is, but it's really just a way of asking what happens to a rule once it leaves the page, once it's not just text anymore.
When it hits the real world, how does it actually function when you try to enforce it at scale?
Exactly. We're looking at policy as a complex system.
And complex systems, regardless of the good intentions behind them, they have these predictable, almost mechanical behaviors.
So our mission for you listening is to really identify this specific repeating design flaw we found buried in all of these documents.
It's a pattern that causes genuinely well-intentioned policy.
Policy driven by care, by moral conviction.
Right. To consistently produce outcomes that are more harmful, way more expensive, and just structurally so much more complex than what you started with.
We want to show you how to separate the intent of a policy from its actual outcome as a system.
And that separation is it's crucial. This is really an exercise in pattern recognition.
Once you see it, you can't unsee it.
You can't. Once you recognize this underlying dynamic, this predictable way things fail, you can spot it everywhere. It doesn't matter if you're talking about global migration or, local parking rules.
Recognizing that mechanism is the first step.
It's the essential first step to actually changing it.
Okay, so let's unpack this policy failure cycle.
Yeah.
Because it is, as we found, just strangely universal.
It is.
It's a progression that always seems to lead to this unnecessary explosion of complexity and cost.
And it almost always begins with visibility, something uncomfortable. It could be poverty, addiction, some kind of unapproved market activity.
Something society finds challenging.
Exactly. It becomes more and more visible in the public square. And this visibility naturally causes concern to rise.
But here's the pivot, right? This is the critical moment.
This is it. That concern very quickly tightens into what the sources call moral certainty.
Moral certainty. That's such a powerful phrase.
It really is.
Because it means the issue is immediately framed as good versus evil, right versus wrong.
Yes. It stops being a complex problem to manage.
And it becomes a behavior that has to be, eliminated?
Stamped out, eliminated, exactly. And that shift, it immediately builds this intense public pressure to do something.
Action.
Right. And when moral certainty is the engine, the easiest, most satisfying tool is always some form of punishment or prohibition.
Just stop the thing, outlaw it, punish anyone who keeps doing it.
And that's where the system immediately starts working against its own goals. Because the original intent to stop the behavior, it doesn't actually happen.
Not in the way people expect.
It rarely does. The progression is it's brutally simple. Persistent human behavior doesn't disappear just because we passed a law against it.
So what does it do?
It adapts. The behavior adapts to the new rules, the new enforcement. Think of it like water, finding the path of least resistance. The activity doesn't stop.
It just moves.
It moves. And when it moves, you get 3 immediate negative outcomes.
Okay, what are they?
So first, because the activity is now illegal, it's forced into the shadows. And risk immediately concentrates there.
On who?
Usually on the people who had the fewest resources to begin with, the most vulnerable.
Okay, so that's one. Risk concentrates.
Second, the costs of managing the problem, they move somewhere else, often completely out of sight of the people who made the policy.
We'll come back to that one. And third,
the enforcement structure itself. The regulations, the police, the courts. It all gets exponentially more complex just to manage this new illegal environment that we ourselves created.
that complexity part is it's wild.
Yeah.
But when this cycle fails, when the problem is still there, just in this more damaging, more expensive form, the reaction is never, maybe our approach was wrong.
Never. The reaction to the failure is almost always, well, clearly we haven't been tough enough yet.
We need more.
More enforcement, harsher punishment, stricter rules, which of course just guarantees the whole loop repeats, but this time it's worse. It doubles down on the complexity and concentrates the risk even further.
And here's where it gets really interesting for me. It's the realization the sources kept coming back to.
The no villains idea.
Exactly.
Hmm.
You do not need bad actors for policy to go catastrophically wrong.
That is probably the most uncomfortable truth in all of this.
You can have a room full of people with, utterly sincere concern.
Genuinely decent intentions.
Right. Moral clarity, a real desire to protect people, all the good stuff.
You can still end up with a policy architecture that makes things significantly more harmful, vastly more expensive, and basically impossible to unwind.
That is a huge mental shift. Because if you start out thinking every policy failure is because someone is incompetent or acting in bad faith,
Then you just spend all your time trying to find the villain.
right. But if the problem is architectural, if it's a design flaw in the system itself, then looking for villains is just a distraction.
It is. But that raises a tough question, doesn't it? If it's all just structural, does that mean policymakers aren't accountable for the outcomes?
That's the challenge. We absolutely need accountability, but we have to understand the mechanism first.
So accountability isn't about their intentions, it's about...
It's about their design. You have to question the design.
Absolutely. Because once a policy is implemented, once it becomes a system, it stops responding to those initial intentions, no matter how pure they were.
So what does it respond to?
Incentives. It starts responding purely to incentives. That's just how complex systems work.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Think about your thermostat at home. The heating system doesn't care if your intention is to save energy or to be comfortable.
Right.
It only responds to one thing: the temperature you set. That temperature is the incentive. The system just follows it mechanically. Policy is exactly the same. The incentive structure you create dictates the outcome.
So we do need morality to get the conversation started. That sense of outrage about harm or exploitation.
That's vital. It has to start there. But we ask morality to do something it just can't do on its own.
Which is?
Predict consequences at scale. You can't ask a moral conviction to accurately forecast how millions of rational, adapting people will change their behavior when you roll out a new set of rules.
For that, you need
Evidence.
messy, uncomfortable, rigorous evidence. So evidence doesn't replace our values. It's more like a safety check.
Exactly. Evidence is there to stop our deeply held values, our moral certainty, from blinding us to the actual measurable consequences that are happening in the real world.
You use values to define the problem.
But you have to use evidence to design the solution.
And when we look across all those different fields, drugs, sex work, punishment, migration, the evidence all points in a shockingly consistent direction.
It really does. It reveals the true dynamics of these systems when they're put under this kind of pressure.
So what were those key data points? I think we should spend some time here because these are the takeaways you can apply to basically any policy area.
Okay. The evidence consistently found four main things. First, as we've said, persistent human behavior doesn't just vanish under pressure.
It shifts.
It shifts its location, its form, its characteristics.
Right. It's like squeezing a balloon. The air doesn't disappear, it just bulges out somewhere else.
That's a great analogy. So policy isn't deciding if the behavior happens.
It's just deciding where it happens and how risky it becomes.
Precisely. Which leads right to the second point. Enforcement consistently reshapes underground markets far more than it eliminates them.
How so?
Well, prohibition doesn't get rid of demand. It just gets rid of legal protection, transparency, and quality control. By making it riskier for everyone, you actually create huge profit margins for the people who are willing to stay in that now illegal market.
And that often leads to more violence, right? To manage disputes.
Exactly. It consolidates the market around the most ruthless actors.
Which brings us to point 3, the real human cost. Risk always migrates toward the least protected people. Why does that always happen?
It's about resources. The wealthy or well-connected can absorb the costs of prohibition.
They can afford better lawyers, higher prices.
Or they can just move the activity somewhere else. The people who get caught in the net are always the ones without financial buffers, without legal knowledge, without a political voice.
So policy that's designed around this idea of moral certainty.
Yeah.
It's essentially outsourcing all the new risk onto the most vulnerable.
Yes. And the fourth point, which is crucial for budgets and accountability, is that the costs of this failure rarely land where the decisions were made.
They get absorbed somewhere else entirely.
They do.
Yeah.
In the sources we looked at, we saw the costs from, say, punitive migration policies. They wouldn't show up in the Justice Department budget.
Where would they show up?
On the balance sheets of emergency rooms, social work departments, local schools, mental health services. Those are the public services that quietly absorb the human damage of a system designed to punish. instead of manage.
And that hidden cost, that leads right back into the cycle we talked about. When an uncomfortable situation like rising addiction rates or more visible homelessness, which are the consequences of the policy.
Right, they're the blowback.
When those things become more visible, that visibility gets mistaken for growth of the original problem.
And that's the dangerous confusion. The consequence gets confused for the cause. And when that happens, urgency replaces curiosity.
Urgency demands immediate action.
Which almost always means just doubling down on the policy that's already failing.
And that is the moment. That's where effective governance just dies.
It is.
When urgency replaces curiosity, all the feedback from the system, the data on costs, on risk, it all gets ignored.
It does, because the policymakers are convinced they already have the moral solution. And when you ignore feedback, systems just drift into these damaging loops that become incredibly financially devastatingly hard to stop.
And what's amazing is that none of these are radical ideas. This is basic systems thinking.
It is, but as the sources noted, it is astonishingly easy to forget all of it the second moral certainty grabs the microphone.
So the key to breaking this cycle, it has to be about asking a different question.
A fundamentally different question.
We have to shift away from the emotionally satisfying moral debate and toward the consequential one. The key question we kept saying wasn't, is this behavior right or wrong?
The core systemic question, the one that cuts through all that moral static, has to be, what actually happens when we try to stop it this way?
That's the consequential question. That's the one that reveals all the hidden costs and design flaws.
And it forces you to ask specific, granular follow-ups. You can't just make general statements.
The system has to report back.
Yes, you have to ask, who actually taps to these new rules and how? Who specifically ends up paying the price for this enforcement? Is that price even in a budget somewhere? Who becomes demonstrably more vulnerable under this policy over the next 5 years?
And critically, which public services, which city departments that no one is even thinking about right now will end up quietly absorbing the consequences 3 years from now?
The moment you start asking those specific, measurable, consequential questions, the old arguments about right and wrong, they start to look really incomplete.
They become secondary.
They become secondary to the question of design effectiveness.
And the power of this framework is its universality. Once you see this pattern, this dynamic of incentives overriding intentions, you see it everywhere.
Everywhere. Far beyond the controversial topics we started with.
You start to see the same mechanics in, what, education policy?
Education funding, healthcare reform, financial regulation, even in things like how municipal fines or zoning laws unintentionally punish people with lower incomes.
The surface issues are totally different.
But the underlying architecture of the system, when it's under that moral or financial pressure, it behaves in the exact same way.
So if we accept this, that policy is a mechanism and not a sermon, what does better even look like?
The source material was really clear about this. Better policy isn't softer or laxer or indifferent.
It's structurally superior.
It is, and that superiority comes from a shift in approach. Better policy has clearer, measurable goals. It has slower, more considered reactions.
Fewer moral shortcuts.
Far fewer. And much more sustained attention paid to the incentive structure it's creating. It means having a real institutional willingness to ask what happens next and to whom before you act.
So it shifts the focus from delivering a politically satisfying moral statement
to designing a long-term functional tool. The goal of policy design has to shift to harm reduction and systemic stability, not moral purity.
You have to design for visibility.
Exactly. The design systems for visibility, so problems can be managed out in the open with regulation and support. Not for fear, which just pushes everything into the darkest corners.
And ultimately, it means making decisions based on the long-term cost to society.
Not on short-term political reassurance. It is, no question, a less emotionally satisfying way to govern. But it just works infinitely better.
So what does this all mean for the sources you brought in? If there's one single idea to take away from this whole deep dive, what is it?
For me, it's this core insight about what power policymakers actually have.
Which is?
Law doesn't get to choose human behavior.
No, it doesn't.
It only gets to choose how expensive and how harmful managing that behavior becomes. That is the true leverage point in policy.
And once you see policy through that lens, the whole conversation changes. It stops being a debate about winning a moral argument.
Or about judging people's choices. It becomes a rigorous engineering challenge.
How do we design systems we can actually live with?
Systems that minimize harm and maximize stability instead of maximizing moral certainty. This whole deep dive, it wasn't about giving answers for drug policy or migration.
No, it was about learning how to look.
How to slow down, spot these repeating patterns, and just rigorously separate emotional intent from the actual observable outcomes.
So our final thought for you, the listener, is this. Take this framework with you this week. Try to identify this exact pattern. Uncomfortable visibility, leading to moral certainty, leading to a complex, costly failure in a new area of policy or public life you come across.
Look for those places where the stated intention of a policy and its measurable outcome have quietly drifted hundreds of miles apart.